Okay, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's great to be bringing you the next in our series of webinars as part of the IWA Water Loss Specialist Group. For those that don't know, I'm Mark Nichol and I'm part of the management committee and part of the team that helps to organize these webinars. We've got a great session today on as a service, data as a service, or what Amir will talk about this, something as a service, as a business model for implementing water loss programs. It's not just about water loss, of course, but being the water loss specialist group, that's kind of our focus. But in general, how DaaS offers transformative approaches to implementing projects within the water, wastewater, and other industries. Amir is the CEO of SWAN, the Smart Water Networks Forum. I'm sure there's many people who are familiar with SWAN. A lot of IWA members are also members of SWAN, or your organizations will be. So it's great to be able to do this as a joint webinar between the two organizations today. So Amir is going to give us an overview, first of all, on DaaS, the business model, some of the misconceptions in general around it. And then the second part of this webinar, we have a second presenter, Adiv Paradise, who's a data scientist at Mueller. And he's going to talk about implementation of DaaS projects, particularly around leak detection and on trunk mains on large diameter pipes. So he's going to talk about some of the technical challenges, both from a supply side, but also on implementing these projects. We will finish with a Q&A. We tend to put up to an hour for these sessions. So we should have enough time for the two presenters, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll ask them at the end, or we'll open the floor to people to ask questions. So on that note, I will pass over to Amir, who's going to be our first presenter today. And Amir, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having us, and doing this with SWAN together. So my name is Amir. I'm the CEO of SWAN, the Smart Water Networks Forum, and this topic is very dear to my heart. One, because I think the water sector is in need of a shakeup, not just in terms of new technologies, but how utilities implement these technologies. And two, I did a PhD on this topic. So today I'm going to talk about myth busting the DaaS model, data as a service model for water utilities. And here we go. Actually, all right. So this is the agenda for today. It's not going to be your typical talk, and I want to make it interactive. So I want people to contribute, say their ideas in the chat. We'll have interpretive art. We'll learn from other big companies. We'll have a game show, and I'm going to debunk a myth about swans. So starting with some arts, any guesses what this is? And this was created before ChatGPT. Any guesses in the chat? Mark, you have any ideas? I think actually you know what this is. So, all right. Okay, whoever said that, it's exactly right. Data tsunami. So really, we're in the industry now. We're facing this kind of data overload in the number and types of sensors that are out there, the frequency data is collected. You hear a lot of buzzwords like Gen AI, digital twins, so forth. But I think the challenge is understanding what these mean and how they can be implemented. So this is a model that SWAN created to basically describe what a smart water network is, how it interconnects, and there's challenges in each of these layers related to big data. So first, a utility has to ask themselves, should I collect data? Because there's going to be challenges with security, quality, and once they collect that data, they have to really figure out how are they going to manage it. So big data is very complex in terms of storage, transmission, standardizing it. And once they have this data under control, how do they fully utilize it? So within utilities, there's different data silos, lack of talent to implement these solutions. So big data is still a core challenge in the water sector. and it affects utilities of all sizes that want to implement smart water solutions. So how can we learn from other sectors? Because big data is very common wherever you look. So starting off with the manufacturing sector, this is a great visualization of how a company can move from delivering a product to a service. So it's developed by the Advanced Services Group in the UK. And on the bottom, it really describes what a product is. So gaining access to different kinds of equipment. And then the intermediate level, you're getting more reassurance that that product is properly maintained. And the highest level moves away from delivering the product itself and more on a capability. So guaranteeing a certain kind of outcome. And so here are some really innovative companies I think we can all agree. And one thing that they have in common is that they changed how we look at physical things like CDs, DVDs, where we stay when we travel, and really was moving like from owning something to wanting an on-demand outcome. So getting the music, the movies you want, when you want it, wherever you are. And there's lots, as Mark said, there's lots of these as a service models in the water sector, and really as a service can mean anything. It's usually tied to cloud computing, but one that we saw a lot of interest in, and we have a SWAN data as a service community of practice, is this aspect of data as a service. And we came up with this definition, really a partnership model in which a technology supplier is operating and maintaining specific hardware. And they can do a variety of things in terms of collecting, transmitting, processing the data, and the utilities paying for the results. And that word results can mean just acquiring the data itself, a summary report, or predictive analytics. But the difference between this and like I showed just the product is that the supplier is much more seen as a partner who has to remain in constant communication with the utility, and it's really shifting the risks and sharing the risks and rewards. And really, DaaS can apply to anything that has to do with hardware. So here are some different water applications like leak detection, customer metering, pipeline condition assessment, and also on the wastewater side, like sewage overflow monitoring, lift station monitoring, and so forth. And really, it's no one size fits all. So this shows by the SWAN layers, the in-house way of doing things, and kind of the outsourced DaaS approach. And there's lots of mix and match scenarios. So one example is called network as a service, where a utility will own the hardware. They will maintain the sensors, but a company will provide the data transmission. So like the IoT network or fixing where an antenna is. And then the utility will just take it from there. There's also end-to-end solutions where a DaaS supplier is installing the equipment, maintaining it in the field, and helping deliver those different results. So there's lots of scenarios where DaaS could make sense, but there are also a lot of different challenges. And here is a good representation of some of the different benefits that DaaS can offer. And like any as-a-service model, it's usually a subscription model. And these are often like long-term contracts, like 5 to 10-year contracts. One thing about DaaS is that instead of paying for all the equipment up front, you can really spread those costs throughout the contract and really understand what the costs are, so you can better forecast them. In terms of this interoperable architecture, so DaaS really helps with this in-between process. So instead of a utility worrying, like if a network is going from 3G to 4G, changing their equipment, all that responsibility is on the vendor. And I heard an example from an Australian utility say, why would I want to implement a system and it's outdated 6 months later? So this is an example of where DaaS can really support. And really, this is one of the main benefits, getting consistent and accurate results. So these contracts are often based on service level agreements or SLAs, where if service isn't being met, vendor can actually be fined. And so here are some quotes from utilities that have been on this DaaS journey. So a utility in Australia really showed that it was more of a partnership agreement, like a 10-year relationship. Utility in the US said that data quality was the main driver for them. And in California, they really said that, like I mentioned, the risk mitigation factor was really what they were looking for. And so there's lots of challenges. So we had, Mark was on this, a SWAN APAC call, and we asked what are some key barriers to using DaaS within your organization. So you probably see some things here that you would agree with, like procurement is a challenge for a lot of different things, but like water utility bureaucracy, lack of understanding, the different risks of failures. And so if you take all these challenges, you can really group them into 3 different buckets, I would say. So the first is related to people. If you think about Airbnb, the first thing people asked is, what do you mean, like, I'm gonna have to make my own bed? So anytime you have a new type of model, there's gonna be resistance. Within utilities, people have different agendas. They're afraid of losing control, jobs being replaced. Also with processes, letting go of assets, it's unclear where to begin. So we mentioned like procurement, lack of understanding. And on the technology side, a utility can already have its own internal solutions, or be concerned about like data security, data ownership, and all these things really boil down to one word, and that's trust. So if you think about it, there has to be trust on both sides. Data management is very sensitive, so a utility has to trust that the vendor is not going to hold them hostage. In the same sense, a vendor who's putting forth all this initial capital costs has to trust that utility is not going to silo their solution, but really implement it. And so I've seen a lot of different implementation trends. So I did a global utility survey, also spoke with a lot of different utilities. And one of the main things is that it's very important to define roles up front. So who's responsible for what, who's going to own the data, who's liable if something goes wrong. This really impacts people in the field, so OT positions, so they have to really buy into DaaS. Water and wastewater are not the same. So I don't know, people here work in the wastewater side of things, but it's harsh down there. It's really difficult to get good data quality. There's abrupt rainfall patterns. So oftentimes what we've seen is that on the wastewater side, utilities will want more advanced analytics, like a summary report or predictive analytics, while on the water side, they would be more comfortable with just getting the data on its own. So once a utility understands the value of this model, they're more likely to implement it for more than one solution. So like smart metering and water quality monitoring, and even more than one solution. And this is probably the most important. It really depends on a utility's specific needs. For example, if a utility is not collecting any data, then getting data 3 times a day would be very valuable. They wouldn't necessarily need like 24/7 data uptime. So these are just a couple of the trends that we've seen. But now we're going to see who's been paying attention and do a little game. So has anyone here seen the game show Is It Cake? Maybe people in the US, but basically the idea is that we're going to show different cakes, and you have to also say, is it DaaS? Okay, so are you guys ready to play? And you have to put yes or no in the chat box. Okay, so the first example is predictive insights. So basically, in this case, a vendor is taking a utility's existing data and then providing AI insights. Would this be DaaS? So I'm going to wait for the chat. Any takers? yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes. This is actually more SaaS, and I'll explain why after. Um, Now the car service Uber. Okay, I think that's Mark answering. Enrique, thank you. Yes. All right. Last one, cloud services. So like Amazon, Microsoft, um, Google. What do you guys think about this? Okay, so this one is actually the most tricky, and you could argue either way, but I'm gonna say yes, and I'll explain why. Okay, so getting back to our magical staircase. So starting off with the product. So in the auto industry, this product would be like buying a car. And so basically you're responsible for everything. You have the products. A more advanced service would be like leasing a car or a car rental. So they're making sure that the car is up to different standards. And how you move to a capability is basically in this situation, Uber is still managing the car for you through a partnership agreement. So when you get in that car, you expect it to have gas to get you where you want to go, but Uber is guaranteeing that you're going to get from point A to point B and providing you that on-demand data, what's available. And in a funny twist of fate, Uber actually compares themselves to the water sector, transportation as reliable as running water. And so now just to bust some common myths. So one is that DaaS is the same as SaaS. The easiest way to differentiate this is that DaaS suppliers are getting their hands dirty. So they're the ones who are going in the field, calibrating the equipment, often installing it, and generating the data, while SaaS providers, also innovative, are taking the existing data and doing their own algorithms. DaaS is only for utilities that aren't advanced. So it makes sense that a utility with not a lot of manpower would want to use DaaS, but actually some of the most advanced utilities in the world, like PUB or DC Water, prefer this model because there's a saying, the more you know, the more you outsource. So they know exactly the cost of doing things, and then they can have a vendor implement that for them who can scale more easily. With DaaS, my data is less secure. So actually, if you think about cloud computing, they have very high standards, and they use automated software patches. And in this case, the reason why you could argue that cloud services are DaaS or not DaaS, one is that they are technically like getting their hands dirty, making sure that everything's working correctly. But cloud services are very unique. They fall into their own category, often called platform as a service. And with DaaS, I have to sell my data. Actually, most utilities in the contract, they stipulate that the data is theirs. And lastly, swans are purely gentle. That's really not true during breeding season. And just to conclude, SWAN has this great resource called the SWAN DaaS Playbook, which is kind of like a choose your own adventure. So we have an overview of what DaaS is. We have a section with technical implementation advice with different critical success factors and 14 different use cases. So it's a great resource. You can find it on the SWAN website. And with that, I want to hand it off to Adiv, who's going to dive into a DaaS leak detection case study. Thanks.
Thank you, Amir. Let me share my screen. All right. All right, thanks, Amir. For those who have forgotten the introduction or joined late, my name is Adiv Paradise. I work with Mueller Water Products here in Canada. I did not know that, Amir, about SWAN, so I appreciate learning something. Here in Canada, we have Canada geese. They are also very dangerous during breeding season. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into one particular application of data as a service, in particular using it to find leaks on large diameter mains. And I want to preface by saying that there are many ways to find leaks on large diameter mains. At Mueller Water Products, we use acoustic technology, and that's what I'm familiar with. So I'm only going to be focusing really on acoustic technology. That's not to say other methods aren't useful or valuable. They all have their pros and cons. We're just going to focus on what I'm most familiar with, so we can hopefully be as informative as possible. So you might ask, why would we want to do proactive leak detection on trunk mains? Isn't leak detection on small diameter mains all the rage? That's where all the development has been, where all the money has been. And there are a couple of reasons. Reason number one is the cost to repair a burst trunk main, so these large diameter mains. It can be way, way higher. On average, 80 times the cost of repairing a small diameter main. The city of Calgary here in Canada had a major trunk main burst last summer. It cost them $20 to $25 million to do those initial repairs. And a huge portion of that is just the fact that you have to do this as an emergency. You didn't plan this work, it's not scheduled. Calgary, a few months later, did an inspection of the main and did 21 additional repairs. Those 21 repairs cost $15 to $20 million in total, compared to that 20 to 25 for the emergency work they had to do just for that burst earlier in the summer. So it can still be an enormous cost to the utility. Number two is the volume of water lost. Most of the non-revenue water utility loses is not from trunk bursts. It's those smaller diameter pipes. But when a large pipe bursts, it can still be a huge amount of water that can pose severe problems. A 76 centimeter pipe, if it blows under full pressure, that can release over 50 million liters of water in just a few hours. It's just an incredible amount of water that comes out of these pipes. That water can do enormous amounts of damage to communities. In this example here, that is an 80 centimeter pipe that blew, and you can see it has just completely eaten that car into what used to be the street. And what that means is that when these pipes burst, these failures are pretty much always high profile. These are the bursts that are guaranteed to land a utility on the front page of the news, sometimes at the national or even international level. And these problems, they can just compound. When you have a trunk main that bursts, there are fewer other trunk mains that could carry that load compared to the small diameter pipes. So you place additional load on other pipes, and that can lead to subsequent breaks. It's fairly common, actually, when a trunk main bursts, to have additional bursts that come in the hours and days to follow. And what this can end up in is water shortages. You can have thousands of people out of water for days at a time. When Calgary had their big trunk main burst, they ended up having to put in pretty significant water restrictions for several months. And I'm not talking like don't water your lawn every day of the week. Like they were saying, don't take showers every day. It got to be that bad. So this all sounds fairly bleak. You might be thinking, oh my God, we all have these just disasters in the street waiting to happen. But it is actually not that bleak. There are solutions that are in the works, using data as a service as a model for how to deliver proactive leak detection. And the promise of this technology is that this can allow utilities to find leaks before they become a problem. We have come to believe as an industry that these big trunk bursts, they don't just happen instantly. They're usually preceded by other problems that can be detected. And so you can go in there and you can prevent these big catastrophes from happening. So is this possible? Is this pie in the sky? It is, in fact, possible. So I'll give you two examples of where this has been done successfully. The city of Las Vegas is this big city in the desert. So water is already a concern there. And then on top of that, they have all these big hotels and casinos. The hotels in Las Vegas alone account for over 10 billion liters of water annually. So they really depend on that water supply. On top of that, Las Vegas is often a destination for high-profile, high-dollar events. So the city of Las Vegas knew that if there were to be a catastrophic trunk burst that would cut off water to the hotels, that would have just unthinkable implications financially, economically, politically. So they wanted to make sure that they had something in place to prevent this. So they invested in an acoustic trunk monitoring system. That system did find a leak under a major thoroughfare, actually not that long before a major event was to take place. They're able to go in, get it repaired, and prevent that leak from becoming a catastrophe on international news. Another utility had a trunk main feeding an airport. You can see the airfield in the satellite photo there. This trunk main, a 70 centimeter steel pipe, ran right alongside the highway that led to that airport. So they knew that if that main were to blow and take the street with it, that would not just cut off water to the airport, it would also cut off people from the airport. It would basically mean having to shut down all air traffic out of that airport. London Heathrow just had a major outage for electrical reasons a few weeks ago, and just that day and a half of not having air service had a measurable impact on the British economy. So if this trunk main were to blow, talk about risk of failure. So the utility wanted to invest in something proactive. They installed acoustic correlators along this pipe, and then those correlators did pick up a pinhole leak. The pinhole leak formed. Within 24 hours, the system caught it and alerted the utility. It was 76 liters per minute. And they were able to go in, schedule overnight repairs. So they didn't have to even cut off traffic to the airport at all, and get that leak repaired before it became a big trunk burst that would have just massive, horrible implications. Now, I'm not a salesman, so I'm not going to pitch this as like this is a magical sell-all solution that fixes everything. I'm an astrophysicist, I'm a scientist, so I will be honest with you, this is really hard to do. This is relatively new technology. We are still as a field learning how to do this. So what makes this so challenging? Why doesn't everyone have one of these in their utility? The first part of it is really just the state of the field. There's a little bit less pressure on utilities and service providers to develop leak detection technology for trunk mains because most of the loss, most of the pressure has been on those smaller distribution mains. You can think of a water network as kind of like a tree where you have a couple large trunks and then tons and tons of smaller branches that come off that trunk. So when you're thinking about just the trunk, there's way fewer kilometers that you have to worry about compared to those smaller branches. Statistically, the brakes are going to be on the smaller pipes. And that's borne out not just in terms of just numbers of pipes, but the actual brake rates. Big pipes, they are stronger. They don't break as often. It's about 5 times fewer brakes per 100 kilometers compared to a smaller pipe. So when a utility is thinking about where are we going to invest in leak detection solutions to prevent water loss, they're losing almost all their water through those smaller pipes. That's where the breaks are happening. So that's where the research has been. On top of that, we have some pretty difficult technical challenges that make it a little bit harder to find leaks on trunk mains as opposed to small diameter mains. Number one is just the layout of the water network. When you're dealing with small diameter mains, it's often in a grid, right? Think about neighborhoods in a city. So that if you're putting sensors on that grid, you have some ability to have it be redundant. You have overlapping pairs of sensors. If one sensor goes out of service, others will pick up a leak. You can combine detections from multiple directions in order to be more confident that there's a leak there. When you're dealing with these larger pipes, they're typically moving water from one location to another so that it can be distributed, which means that you're laying out the sensors kind of sequentially in a line. That means you don't have any redundancy on the detection side. If a sensor fails, then you don't have coverage on that part of the pipe. Second element is just the sensitivity the system demands. Large pipes take more energy to vibrate. It takes more energy to make them pass along that information about the leak. That means that any sensor, any hardware that gets deployed, it has to be more sensitive than for small diameter mains. So we can't just take the technology we developed for the small pipes and put it on the big pipes. You have to go back to the drawing board and figure out how do we get this sensitive enough to find these leaks. The leaks that we're looking for, they have a unique acoustic profile. When sound travels down large diameter pipes, higher frequencies of sound, those higher pitches, they're lost pretty much instantly. So when you're listening for leaks on a pipe, we're really only hearing very low frequencies, which means that all the algorithms, all the data processing systems that are developed for those small diameter mains, you can't bring that over to the transmission side. It doesn't work. You have to develop different ways of analyzing the data to identify what's a leak and what's not a leak. On top of those pressures on the hardware, that it has to be sensitive enough, it has to be listening at lower frequencies, the pipes themselves are a challenge. There are fewer places where you can access these pipes. So these sensors, which already have to be more sensitive, now they have to be further apart. So on average, they're further away from the leaks. It's harder to get into the pipes. You have to go into valve chambers and other access points. And that also places constraints on the hardware design. It has to be designed specifically to be able to be attached to these larger pipes. You can't just go and strap it to like a small couple centimeter wide pipe. It has to be a specific form factor that can actually integrate with these larger pipes. These larger pipes, they're transporting water typically from reservoirs and pumping stations, which means that your listening devices, they're also closer to those pumping stations. Those pumping stations, they produce sound at low frequencies, which is where we're looking for those leaks. Those are the frequencies that travel far. What this means is that on basically every pipe segment, your hardware is going to be picking up not just leaks, but also typically stations and other really annoying noisemakers in both directions. And that can very easily drown out any kind of leak signal you're looking for. So it just places quite a bit of additional pressure on service providers to develop technologies and algorithms to actually pull out the part of the signal that we're looking for. So how can we do this? How can data as a service be a model that actually gets us to that solution? So first, I want to highlight a key point about data as a service, in particular when it comes to leak detection on water mains, where there is so much pressure to keep costs low. And that's that data as a service is only useful as a model if it can provide actionable knowledge to the utility. So the first thing that we need is hardware, right? As Amir said, hardware is the basis of a data as a service. And the challenge with leak detection is that you can't really skimp on the hardware. If you don't have coverage on a part of the network, then you're not protected against a leak there. Remember that on large diameter mains, this is really about insurance, right? Against those big headline grabbing catastrophes that will just blow away all of your political capital. So what this means is that this places a lot of pressure on service providers to keep the data side of the equation as affordable and as efficient as possible so that you can maximize the amount of hardware that's in the ground. Unfortunately, if you maximize the amount of hardware in the ground, that's going to mean a huge amount of data. So that is an added challenge, which means that the second ingredient, this is the part where data as a service really comes into play, is that there's going to be a data filtration and reduction pipeline. And I'm going to elaborate a little bit on what Amir said about data, and I'm going to argue that data is just numbers. It's not anything that actually tells you anything. Information is what you get when you add context to that data. When you say, what does this data actually mean? If you can figure out what to do with that information, then that's intelligence, right? That becomes actionable knowledge that then becomes useful. So data as a service has to get us from data to intelligence and actionable knowledge. In the system that we're designing here, data is just going to be what the hardware produces, right? It's just going to be those recordings for acoustic detectors. And if we just handed a client all of these recordings, it would be a flood of data. It would be just an obscene operational cost just to handle all of this. So that means that we employ advanced algorithms to then add context to that data, try to distill it down to a little bit less to work with, like say detecting individual noise sources at individual locations on the pipes. That's still a lot to work with. Every one of those noise sources could be wasted money due to a false positive of rolling out a truck where there's no leak. So then we leverage expert data analysis to figure out what do we do with that? How do we narrow that down to which ones are actually worth going and investigating? And what can we hand to the utility for them to actually go and investigate and find a leak? So for leak detection, what that looks like typically is a large distribution of smart sensors out on the pipes. They're going to record, they're going to do their correlations, and then they send that data into a centralized software system that then turns that data into information, right? Pulling out those detected noise sources. That information then flows to the analysis step, which is going to be either AI or humans, or maybe a combination of the both. And that's going to result in, okay, here are just the things that the utility needs to go and investigate. And send maybe an alert to someone's phone saying, hey, we think there may be a leak at 43rd and 5th. here's the characteristics. We recommend you go and investigate. That's actionable knowledge the utility can then take away and go. So you might notice that this diagram looks a little bit like a tree, and I think that's not a mistake or not a coincidence that water networks and data networks have that similarity. The reason that data as a service is an efficient way to solve this problem is because just like a tree, we can get maximum value to the roots of the system, the utility, by pulling sugars, by pulling information and data from a large distribution of those smaller branches. Now, we can really supercharge this when we recognize that the endpoint of this process is not an app. It's not a notification to the utility. It's people, right? Utilities have people on the ground who go and do the investigation. And those people, they actually have the best knowledge. They have the most salient information and knowledge about what's going on the ground. So if we make the human in the analysis step a scientist, then when those people on the ground pass their knowledge back up the chain, then that scientist can incorporate that knowledge into this process and flow that back into the system by improving on the system and responding to that knowledge. And so rather than a tree, then this becomes more of a circulatory system where information and knowledge is circulating in both directions through the system. And it becomes this living thing that can evolve, it can adapt. And that relationship between the human analysts, the scientists, and the utilities, people on the ground, that is the beating heart of the system. Now, when we make this data as a service, remember, this is not being done in-house. Typically, there's not just going to be one analyst at the company. There's going to be multiple analysts, and each analyst is going to have relationships with multiple utilities, multiple clients. And so information is not just flowing in two directions, it's flowing in many directions. And these scientists, they're all talking to each other. They're all sharing that information. And this forms this big web of knowledge that can really drive the system forward towards rapid evolution in a scientific ecosystem. It becomes more than just a partnership, but an ecosystem of evolution that allows the system to be constantly iterating and evolving towards higher performance. And that's because the biggest benefit of data as a service is not the data or the hardware, it's the analysis part. That's how you get to those actionable insights, to the knowledge. So for the case of large diameter leak detection, where we're still really learning how to do this, it's still really challenging. There's a lot that still needs to be learned. When data as a service is implemented in this scientific ecosystem, this can really move the whole field forward very, very quickly. And effectively, for every utility that participates in this kind of ecosystem, they basically have access to a staff of scientists who are basically on their team, but they're not on their payroll. It distributes that risk of hiring those people, like Amir said. So when we implement data services this way, this can really drive the industry forward, and this can be a very effective way to prevent really disastrous leaks. So thank you. I will take any questions that we have. And I suppose there might also be questions for Amir.
Thank you very much, Adiv and Amir. Before that, that was fantastic from both of you, both sharing there. As I mentioned at the start, and I've typed in the chat, please do ask any questions. We've got we've got maximum of 20 minutes. If we don't need it, we won't use it. I have some questions, but I don't want to steal the opportunity from everyone else asking questions. So I see our first question has come in. So Amir, this first question's for you. Is DaaS scalable with data volumes and user demands?
Yeah, I guess, could you elaborate, Laura, what you mean by that? Like a specific application?
And Laura, feel free to unmute yourself and
Yeah.
ask the question if you want to, rather than rapidly type to extrapolate.
Yeah.
Or you can
But
type.
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking like specifically in the context of what Adiv provided, so like specifically in the water like leakage space, but in general, as we start to see like data volumes accumulate at like very large scales, like I want to know a bit more about your thoughts on how that scales.
Yeah. So I think it gets back to that big data challenge I said. And in terms of utility doing that in-house, like with their own servers and their like existing data analysts, it's much harder to scale in-house than using a technology provider that's like leveraging the cloud and doing so forth. So I think that's one of the biggest benefits is that it's scalable. I really think that it depends on the type of solution a utility is looking for. Like if they're looking for advanced AI, then it enters a entirely different conversation of like using generative AI and like making it much more like personable to the user. But yeah, definitely to answer your question shortly, I think yes, it is scalable.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Laura.
Yeah.
I have a question for Adiv. I see we've just had another one come in, but I'm going to ask my question first. I thought it was really interesting that you talked about the analyst element of data as a service. And I think one of the takeaways I thought about them was I've always thought of data as a service as getting the data. I think you're taking it one level after data as a service, actually, which is intelligence or insights as a service, not just giving the data as a service, but also the insights and intelligence. And you talked about the importance of that human interaction, that human intelligence. And I was just thinking with artificial intelligence being the big buzzword and everything one's talking about it, where do you see the difference between someone just saying, well, I'll just apply artificial intelligence to that versus human intelligence to that? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think AI can be useful. In my diagram of the system, let me step back to it. I highlight that we can use both. And I think that the challenge with AI is that the benefit of a human is the human can react to the client, right? That information can flow both ways. And that includes being able to flow that information back into system design. So now there's nothing to say that an AI couldn't, in theory, do that as well. But technologically, I don't think we're quite there yet, right? You couldn't have ChatGPT respond to a field crew and say, okay, that's great information. We're going to make these tweaks to how we design the system so that will better detect these leaks. ChatGPT is just not there yet. So in that sense, a human, I think, is a more personable way to provide that level of service. That said, AI in terms of machine learning algorithms can be an extremely powerful way to assist that scientist in the loop in making that analysis and making that decision. If the scientist had to do all of the analysis on her own, then that's not scalable, right? So going back to Laura's question about scalability, this is really, I think, how we get there is leveraging every tool in the toolbox to allow the humans in the loop to deal with as much data as humanly possible, as cheaply as possible, to really get the ecosystem as large as possible.
Amir, do you have any thoughts to add to that from your experience?
No, I just think Adiv has taken the partnership to a whole new level with the circulatory system. I really like that analogy.
Yeah.
But yeah, I see some more questions. And
Yeah, so one, I had a question, and Ash's question is kind of linked to my question. So we'll ask Ash's question, which is basically linked. But do you have any recommendations or experiences to support that can be offered for onboarding water utilities who are new to the DaaS model? I'm sure you've talked to lots of utilities about this, Amir.
yeah, so a couple things I've heard is that one is if a utility is familiar with procuring like SaaS, it's easier to talk about DaaS. The hardest thing is procurement because utilities are used to procuring hardware versus like services. So you really have to explain the value there and the type of contract. I not to do like a plug, but I think that the playbook has a lot of questions that are important for utilities to ask in terms of defining the different roles, like kind of the legal constraints, understanding where they are in terms of their maturity. So I think there's a lot of good resources there, but yeah, maybe Adiv wants to add to that.
Sorry, Amir, could you repeat the
Yeah, like
question?
the easiest way to have explain DaaS to onboard utilities that are not familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I would go back to what you said in your presentation, that it's fundamentally about trust. That DaaS can sound really like intimidating and like, oh, you can invest in this big fancy technological system that's going to take away jobs. And actually, in my experience, that's not the case. It's a way to enable the people already working and doing their jobs to do their jobs more efficiently, to get more work done. And I don't think there's a utility in the world that feels like they don't have enough work to do.
Yeah, very good point. So a great question from Nabil that I know comes up in the international arena in certain markets is that in some places, the government or the utilities themselves insist on having their data locally stored on local servers, and they don't like the cloud. Can DaaS be achieved in this model if the clients require that kind of setup?
I think, yeah, I'll let Adiv take that one because it's like addressed to leak detection. Yeah.
Sure. So this is a challenge. We have a client at Mueller who insists on this. The way that we have kind of come to a compromise with them is actually that cloud platforms do have this consideration. They do account for it. So we have all of our servers for that particular client localized within their country so that it can be done locally there. We still outsource the actual like hardware hosting of that compute power to a cloud platform provider like Amazon, just because it's not cost effective for us to do it on our own hardware. But there are ways for providers to work with clients and figure out, okay, what do we need to do? What kind of limitations we need to place on our compute ecosystem to silo your data and keep it secure?
Yeah, I think that last word you said, secure, that's often from my experiences, that's often the challenge is about data security, data sovereignty, and that kind of is where I see a lot of challenges on adopting smart solutions. Anna's asked a question that, do we have any experiences where DaaS has been implemented on the distribution side? And I personally include trunk mains as part of distribution because distribution is after the treatment plant before the customer. Anna may be talking just about the downstream inside TMA, but examples of where a DaaS model has been implemented and shown benefits to the client. Has there been any cost benefit calculation? And this is links again to a question that I had kind of for both of you is with this trust part and effectively this partnership, you're moving risk from the utility to the supplier. And ultimately that's going to potentially increase cost. But what's the impact on ROI? I have my own opinions to answer that question, but I'll let you guys have a stab at it first.
Yeah.
I can jump in first, Amir, if that's okay on
Yeah,
the leak side.
yeah.
And I think I can actually, I think, also address Graham's question. How do you identify or how do you overcome the difficulty of quantifying benefits of DaaS for preventative things like trunk mains monitoring? Because while yes, trunks and small diameter pipes are all distributing water, it's all part of a distribution system, there is a pretty significant difference between monitoring for leaks on small diameter mains versus large diameter mains. And that small diameter mains, they leak frequently. It's not hard to go in and achieve ROI on small diameter mains by saying, well, we're going to save you, this many millions of liters of water that was non-revenue water loss every year. And so that cost benefit analysis we have done. We know that we can achieve ROI on a large system quite rapidly. I think, if I remember correctly from my onboarding 3 years ago, I think we typically project 1.5 years towards return on investment for our smaller diameter deployments. And the reason for that is that while you're adding additional players into the system and you might think that can increase costs because obviously service providers have to make a profit, ultimately, actually, everyone comes out in the black because there's so much money that's lost to that non-revenue water, both the value of the water, the energy it takes to pump it, the repair costs of going in and do those emergency repairs. We had a client who told us that they saved 600 grand in just a few months of deploying a system just on repair or labor costs, that because they're able to schedule their repairs instead of doing it on an emergency overtime basis, they saved an enormous amount of money just on labor. So even though you're spending money on hardware and data processing, you're spending that money instead of spending money on either doing really labor-intensive survey work to try to be proactive, or going out and doing emergency repairs that include, mitigation for homes, repairing parts of the street that's been blown open, digging up a pipe in the middle of the night. shutting down traffic and so on. For trunk mains and estimating the cost benefit analysis there, I couldn't speak to our projections for ROI, but it is, as Graham said, quite difficult because you're basically talking about catastrophe prevention. How do you estimate what the cost of a potential catastrophe would be? Every utility kind of has their own internal assessment of what is a critical pipe in terms of what would the cost of failure be. So you could do a statistical analysis of saying, okay, a given utility has so many critical pipes in their system with an estimated cost of failure. If this pipe blows, that's $100 million in damage to this critical hospital or something. And so they could estimate, okay, based on this trunk size, that the pipe size, how likely is it to fail in the next 10 years? And so what kind of insurance am I getting against that $100 million catastrophe by investing in data as a service driven leak detection?
Great answer. Amir, do you have anything to add to that?
I think one, just to add that like DaaS is not a golden solution. There are a lot of challenges. Mark actually told me it can't be a dependency as a service. And I think the core issue is co-creation and having contingency planning. So in the beginning, like there could be a challenge, like if a DaaS provider goes out of business, then who owns the equipment? Or how is, after the contract, how is data information, how is that handed over to a next vendor? So you have to be very clear in the contract. And a lot of times the contract is how you build trust. But getting back to the ROI aspect, I think in terms of a utility receiving the value and also for a vendor receiving value and not like underpricing their product, because it's really easy for maybe a DaaS provider to overcommit to things and then go like out of business. I think it gets back, Adiv was kind of alluding to this term TCO, total cost of ownership. So a utility really has to understand what is the value of them doing it in-house versus using a provider in terms of detecting an anomaly that normally wouldn't have gone detected. Like we heard about these trunk mains, having someone go in the field and make sure that you're getting the good data quality in terms of, replacing the battery, making sure things are transmitting the way they should. So I think that has to really be factored into the ROI. And in short, the cost benefit analysis isn't really there yet. And that's why we need to really do that, share more case studies, because I think I showed like the water industry does need this shakeup. And oftentimes it's not a challenge of innovative solutions, but complementary innovation and like business models to support the adoption of these technologies. So I think that we need to kind of understand the value.
Yeah, I'm gonna add my spin on this link to Anna's question, and I'm gonna move to Ronald's question for Adiv, which I think links in quite nicely. But when we're looking at non-revenue water projects, one of the big ways of funding these projects is through what we call performance-based contracts. And the last webinar we had that's up on the YouTube channel was by the chairman of Mueller, who provide performance-based contracts. Now, use of technology in those contracts, for example, which I personally strongly believe technology such as trunk main monitoring systems or distribution systems, pressure, flow, acoustic, whatever the different parameters are, there's an element of risk move to the contractor then, because the contractor's got to deliver his contract and they know, oh, if we put DMAs in and we send people out with listening sticks, we're going to find leaks and we're going to repair and we're going to do pressure management. They're going to hit their numbers. There's more risk to adopt new technologies in that case if you don't trust it. What we're doing with DaaS in this case is the suppliers taking on some of that risk. So it's a bit of a link to cash flow. It's a little bit of a link to support. And back to that trust, because you have to get the data back for it to work. So on that, I think that's where there's a link. I think that ROI calculation actually for DaaS projects, it links somewhat to a ROI calculation for performance-based contracts and how you put that risk in for the products. Ronald's question is, how can you be assured that data coming back from the field is accurate?
Yeah, and I think this does actually really dovetail nicely with what we were just talking about. And what Amir was saying was the basis of DaaS as a service model, which is trust. Ultimately, it comes down to that relationship between the analysts and the providers and the people in the field. So that both includes, and there's really kind of, I think, two ways to interpret Ron's question, and maybe he meant both, maybe one of them, but I think both are actually really salient. How can you be sure the data from your hardware is accurate, but also how can you be sure the data from the field crews is accurate? And that is, I think, where there's trust in both ways, right? It's that the field crews have to have the experience of going out and seeing that the service provider was right often enough to trust that that data is accurate. And the scientist, the analyst, has to also see that as well, right? We need that feedback from the field crew to verify that the hardware is producing accurate data. And when the field crew give their reports, we have to kind of just trust the field crew know what they're doing. They are, in many cases, very experienced, very knowledgeable personnel. They know what their network is doing out in the field better than anybody else does. And so it's our job as a service provider to talk to them, to trust them, to build that relationship where they can tell us what they're seeing out in the field. So one of my biggest clients is San Jose. I have a great relationship with their field crew. If I report something and they go out and they don't find they don't find something right away, then I can have a conversation with them where they say, here's what we did see in the field. And then I can go back to the data that I've got from the system and I can say, well, is what they told me consistent with the data? Can I find a new way to interpret this information such that I have better intelligence, better knowledge that recontextualizes this into maybe it's not a leak, maybe it's a blower on a fan in a vault or something. Or do I really think that we've got something that maybe they didn't catch in the field? And so we can have a dialogue where they can trust me that I'm paying attention to them and I take them seriously. And also I have useful information and I can say, what I'm seeing here is still there, it's growing. Maybe try looking over here, or this is what I think you might be looking for. And they can go back, and this can be an iterative process that gets to a higher degree of performance for both us and for them. So we can't ever really be sure that it's completely accurate because humans are involved and machines are involved, and there's room for error in both those cases. But when you focus on trust and building a trusting relationship between provider and field crews, I think we get closer to being able to be as accurate as possible.
Right. Thank you, Adiv. We have come to the end of our hour now. So I will just share this final slide that is just going to say, thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate Amir taking his time and Adiv. Again, this is a joint webinar that we've got very good support from SWAN. I think it's great to have different organizations that are overlapping and basically driving a change in adoption. SWAN is about smart water technologies. The Water Loss Specialist Group is about addressing the global water loss challenge. And together, there's massive overlap. So I think it'd be great to do more between the IWA and SWAN in the future. As I mentioned, this webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. Please do check it out. We also have a fortnightly emailer. If you're not already on the mailing list, you don't have to be a member of the IWA. You can just sign up at iwawaterloss.com, enter your details, and you'll get it. The next one's out this Friday. So without further ado, I'd say thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. And we look forward to driving this conversation forwards into the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Robert.